Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Luke Younger, who makes music as Helm. Helm released a new album, Chemical Flowers, just recently. We recorded this conversation, I think, just prior to the release of that record, which came out on Pan. It's a wonderful record. The press release describes it as his most direct work to date, which I think is very interesting. That implies to me maybe sometimes something that is quite immediately ingestible, and that wasn't my experience with this record at all. It's a very gloopy, sloshy record. I feel like it would feel like warm jelly if you were to hold it. I refer to the fact that it feels like you're kind of in the womb on this record, just getting signals kind of pulsing through via a membrane. I had a great time speaking to Luke about this one, and a great time speaking to him about his important records as well. He had a very eclectic array of records to talk about here. And as always, you can go to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for more information on Luke's picks and links as well to Luke's own music. So without any further delay, here's Helm on Crucial Listening. Hello Luke, welcome to Crucial Listening.
Hello Jack, thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on. So, like always, you've brought 3 important albums to the table here for us to talk about, but before we turn to the records that you've brought, I want to ask about your own new album, Chemical Flowers, which is released on Pan. So, from the information that I've read about it already, I understand that it was recorded at No Studios on the Essex countryside. So, could you tell me about the studio and what led you to record the album there?
Well, I've been going there for on and off for about, well, I guess the first time I went was 2002 as an invite by John, who owns the place, and he also plays in a band called Liberes. And around, it was sort of like 2002, I was in a band with a bunch of other friends of mine at the time, and he offered us some, like a 3 days recording. So we took him up on his offer, and then I've just kind of used it like as pretty much a central base for my own recording ever since, really, just because it's quite close to me in terms of transport. I can kind of be there in just over an hour from where I live, and I really like John as well. We kind of become sort of like quite good friends and collaborators and stuff over the years with, I've released his band's music and stuff like that. So it just kind of feels like a bit of a second home in a way, without sort of wanting to put too sort of corny a spin on it, but yeah.
And reading as well about your process for the record, it sounded like essentially, and I don't know whether this is typical of the way that you approach recording your music when you're there, but essentially that it's you and the record, and that's it for kind of a continuous burst of, just working the record till it's done. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, these days I kind of I can only really sort of work with one central focus these days, for, I no particular reason, I guess, other than just, I can't really my mind can't really sort of like process sort of multiple things or creative things going on at once. So for this record I was pretty, centralized within the studio and just kind of like going there for extended periods at a time, normally like 3 days at the most, and just kind of diving into it basically. with every record before, with Olympic Mess, I think there was kind of a bit more, the process was spread out across different places. So I was recording a lot more at home and then bringing things into the studio to kind of like work on a little bit there, and also kind of like doing stuff on the road because I was traveling a lot more at the time then as well. So this one did kind of feel much more like a kind of record that was centered around the studio, and the studio itself kind of, you know, sort of became a pretty integral part to the making of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one of the words that really comes up for me when I listen to the record is it does feel quite incubated.
Yeah.
I'm full of thoughts of pregnancy at the moment because my wife is expecting, but I mean, there's something that felt very womb-like about it for me. I mean, there's a lot of sloshing water and also a sense of being almost muffled and enclosed. I mean, do you think that's probably a product of the kind of environment that you were in at the time, or is that just perhaps to do with the fact that that's just the direction that you were heading with this one?
It could have done. I mean, it's difficult to say, really. If it did, it wasn't conscious. But, you know, I'm firmly, happy to accept that, you know, these, like, things may have an influence on the subconscious whilst it's being made, you know. But I think one thing I kind of, like, that sort of became quite apparent to me sort of halfway through making it was that it kind of did feel like more of a kind of swamp-like atmospheric record, whereas the last one was perhaps maybe a little bit lighter and a little bit more kind of, I don't know, played with sort of themes of that could be perceived as being a bit more uplifting, I guess, and this one kind of did feel a bit more kind of like dark and atmospheric, and just kind of more just bleak, I guess, a bit bleaker. But, you know, it wasn't really, it wasn't the intention. It was just kind of like, you know, just at one point I just kind of stopped and I was like, oh shit, you know, this is kind of a bit of a, didn't really expect it to be like this, but, you know, fair enough.
Yeah. And you worked with JG Thirlwell as well for the string arrangement on I Knew You Would Respond, which gives that track such a distinctive twist. Like, obviously, it's difficult to picture what it would have sounded like otherwise. But I mean,
it was sounding quite. It was kind of a weird track because I spent a lot of time on it, just sort of going back and forth, playing with the structure, and it was sort of already unlike anything I'd kind of done previously. I mean, maybe the closest I could have like compared it to was like the Blue Scene track from the World in Action EP, which kind of plays with the, you know, sort of the multiple loops and the saxophone and stuff. But this one kind of seemed to have a bit more of kind of, I don't know, like in my head it kind of had like an almost sort of like regal exotica kind of feel to it. And I guess I wanted to sort of elevate that and heighten the that kind of feel of it more. And the most obvious way of doing it to me was to get a string section in on it. So yeah, I kind of basically just approached JG Thirlwell kind of semi out of the blue, really, mainly because I knew that he was. He'd already been listening to my music, and I've been a fan of his as well for a really long time. And we have a couple of mutual friends, and it was Drew McDowell who put us both in touch.
Right.
And then, he was up for it, and he came to London. He was coming to London actually, like randomly, sort of the week after I'd asked him anyway. So we just met up and chatted about it, and then a month later it was all recorded and I was mixing it. So yeah, it happened quite quickly, and it was kind of quite a nice sort of semi-surreal thing in a way, to have him involved, you know, because I think he's a pretty amazing like musician and artist himself. So it's
fantastic. I mean, what's it like bringing someone else in that scenario? I mean, we've spoken about the fact that you did work on this record quite continually and effectively alone for the most part. I mean, was there any part of you that was like, oh, gosh, what's going to happen here? Because you're bringing in suddenly this external influence into a process which has largely been, by the sounds of it, rather introspective.
Yeah, I mean, there's always like an element of uncertainty about it and whether it's going to work. And also, you know, I've never done any. These were just ideas that I had. You know, there was never any way of knowing that these ideas would ever actually sound good. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
You know, so there's an element of like, ooh, you know, this could go completely wrong, or it could sort of end up being. Well, I think my main worry was kind of like having the string parts sort of become something that could be perceived like I was trying to kind of like make a jump into the neoclassical kind of world, you know, which was, or that composition, this modern composition thing, which I just kind of have like no interest in at all, really. Like, if anything, like my desire to get like to bring these elements in is kind of more of a love of like kind of old 70s progressive rock music and even stuff like the Beatles, you know. I mean, like, yeah, just like hearing elements like these kind of like musical elements and recognizable themes kind of juxtaposed and mixed with very sort of like abstract electronic sounds. I guess that's something I was kind of like interested in sort of exploring on a musical level this time.
I mean, the other strings as well that really caught my ear are I believe they're strings anyway, but on You Are the Database, which are quite terrifying, really. I think especially that late into the record, it really hits quite hard. I mean, who worked on those strings? Was that JG Thirlwell as well, or was
JG as well? Yeah. So he did 4 pieces out of the 8, and they were the 4 that I felt could best be elevated or sort of like amplified with this kind of like, I don't know, just like a sense of the drama and the atmosphere like heightened, and those were the ones that he kind of worked on. So it was the second one, I Knew You'd Respond, You Are the Database, Chemical Flowers, the final track, and Toxic Racecourse, the one which opens the second side. Those were the ones that he contributed to.
I mean, just hearing you talk about as well and just mention a few of the track names, I mean, I've always been quite struck, I think, by the titles of your pieces and your albums. There's something that feels, I think, quite satisfying about the way that they roll out phonetically, and also the way that they kind of mangle meanings from the side of someone who perhaps doesn't have the context that you do of, actually assembling them. I mean, I don't know how easy it is to articulate what leads to the formation of these titles, but is there anything that you can kind of share as to how you come to formulate the sort of titles that kind of cap the pieces?
Well, some of them have kind of like, like semi sort of intentional kind of meanings like behind them. I mean, like sometimes I'm thinking about something and then, related to something going on in my life related to music or whatever, and then I'll just like think of a phrase and I'll be like, oh, well, that works, that'll make a nice track title. And then a lot of the time, the other ones, like a couple of ones you just mentioned, they're kind of just things I hear in daily life that I think are kind of amusing, and removing them from the context they originally appear, and then putting them in this other kind of like context, kind of, it abstracts them a bit further and kind of just makes it, I don't know, it gives them a sort of, I mean, there's an element of humour in some of them as well, or like absurdist kind of humour, I guess. That's sort of like something I'm trying to portray, just so it doesn't all become this like dour, serious thing, I guess.
Right, yeah, of course. I mean, actually, on that point, that definitely feels like it connects with one of the records in particular that you've selected as part of your important albums list, but we'll get to that shortly. I mean, what else have you got on the horizon beyond the album launch? I mean, I understand you've got quite a special show supporting Gazelle Twin coming up in September. I don't know if you can mention about that.
In Walthamstow, which is kind of a really nice thing to be doing, actually, because I'm from E4, which is just down the road, place called Hyams Park. And Walthamstow's kind of, as you know, I guess this is like the closest I'll ever get to playing a local, you know, like a local hometown show. So, and it's this year Walthamstow is London's borough of culture, you know, which kind of is kind of crazy to me to think now, but you know, thinking about what it was like sort of 25 years ago. Yeah, so Luke Turner from the Quietus just kind of asked if I'd be up for playing with Gazelle Twin there, because he's part of the organisation of the event, and yeah, sort of jumped at it really.
Fantastic.
So yeah, doing that, and then I'm also kind of working on a I'm not also kind of working. I am working on a soundtrack for a dance performance, which is kind of like coming together slowly, but this will be sort of like ready by the end of the year. So this is kind of like my next project that I'm sort of jumping into immediately after the record, but you know, good to keep busy, I guess.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
You've done stuff like that before, haven't you? Because I think I remember seeing a performance that you did at the Tate, which was also had a collaborative dance element to it.
Oh yeah, well, that was in the collaboration with the Charles Atlas, the
yes.
Filmmaker and video artist, yeah, and a dancer, or I think she's more of a performance artist actually, but Joanna Constantine. Yeah, we did that. That was kind of more of a sort of improvised kind of group performance where each person was sort of improvising within their own kind of artistic discipline,
right? I see.
Rather than something, you know, that this will be this thing that I'm working on at the moment. It's just going to be a soundtrack. There's going to be no live performance or anything, and it will be performed regularly over, you know, sort of time, the next few years, I guess. So my input will just be to record it, and then they can have a CD or a file which they can press play on afterwards, you know. But yeah, it's going to be a pretty heavy project to sort of get into, right, just when I'm sort of, you know, kind of dealing with the fact that there's an album coming into the world, you know. But yeah,
of course, yeah. I mean, one question I did want to ask on that is that, I mean, do you think about your music differently, or how do you approach what you're doing when you know that the music that you're generating is going to be in dialogue with some form of physical movement?
Well, I've never really done it before, so I guess that's something I'll be finding out in the over the course of the next few months, you know. But yeah, I mean, it kind of like I've seen some of the movements that the dancers are going to be doing, like some of the parts of it, the opening parts, and I can, you know, and it's kind of it's a bit more reassuring to see that, and then you kind of understand why they've maybe got in touch with me, because some of the movements I think are quite sort of similar to some of the, you know, sounds that occupy my pieces. So, you know, I think it'll be okay. Fingers crossed.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm really enjoying the new record, and it's wonderful to get a bit of background on it. And you know, I've also been over the past week listening to these important records that you put forward. So one question I like to ask is about how you thought about the framing of the word important. I mean, was there any particular way that you interpreted that word in order to come up with the list that you've brought here?
Well, I thought about, like, there's many different ways that I thought you could interpret this. You could either pick records that were sort of pivotal in the discovery of music. So, you know, like, oh, what was the first record you ever bought? You know, that's an important record. Even though the first record you bought, you probably wouldn't still listen to or hold in any kind of like regard other than it was, you know, the fact it was the first record you bought.
Yeah.
Or there's the record you heard, you know, somewhere down the line that kind of like turned you on to a particular artist or something, but kind of, you know, that you listen to kind of pretty much on a regular basis. But, you know, it's more of one you keep coming back to, rather than, you know, it just kind of had this like huge like impact at the time. So, I mean, I've kind of sort of tried to do a little bit of both, I suppose, and like I've trying to be a bit mindful of going back to the source of something and think about records that maybe I was unaware of their impact at the moment, but then looking back, I've actually kind of come to realise that they've played a bigger part in my, like music listening than I necessarily realised at the time of hearing them first, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive in. I'll let you pick the first one, whichever one you want to choose, and if you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you as well.
Okay, so the first one is it's Pet Shop Boys, and it's a compilation. It's Discography, the Complete Singles Collection, which, if Discogs is correct, which it normally is, it came out in 1991, and this actually is the first full-length album that I bought it on cassette when I was probably about sort of 12, I would say 11 years old, actually, because it was the year I started secondary school, and I'd kind of probably say that the Pet Shop Boys are probably the band that got me interested in music and like sparked my imagination with regards to what music really was and what it could be, and also how it was presented as well. And yeah, I think there's a lot of the music I listen to now, I think I can kind of like trace back some of my favourite bits of music to the Pet Shop Boys and kind of like discovering this record. Just sort of like the cover of it with the two of them on there, sort of with this. It's a very sort of like minimal cover. You've just got Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe on the front, both sort of like dressed completely differently from each other. Like Neil Tennant in this like sharp suit with like short hair, and then Chris Lowe in this sort of like absolutely ridiculous like white pork pie hat, like dark shades, like kind of some sort of like tartan zip up, like jacket on or whatever.
Yes, strong, isn't it?
Yeah, and then also kind of just like I think around the time like I sort of bought this as well, it was when their album Very came out, so they were kind of like they were on television quite a lot, and I don't know, like, did you ever used to watch the Chart Show? Do you remember the Chart Show?
I don't know.
It was just kind of like
what year are we talking here?
This would have been like late 80s, early 90s. I think they got rid of it in sort of like 93 or 94 or something like that, but it was on ITV every Saturday morning, and I kind of remember like getting like part of a Saturday morning ritual when I was a kid, sort of getting up, watching children's television, and then children's television would end and it would run into the Chart Show. I'd like to add this was about I was about 7 years old here, this isn't teenage viewing, but yeah, like the Chart Show would have these like kind of very, very, looking back on it now, they're probably, it looks incredibly primitive, but at the time, like, it seemed quite sophisticated, like these sort of, that there was no presenter, so it relied on these computer generated graphics to sort of like present the music, and it would sort of like do all these like kind of like random things, like, like start playing a track, and then suddenly sort of about 20 minutes into the track, like a fast forward sign would just come up and it would like fast forward the track onto the next one. It just kind of felt very sort of like, it was sort of like a very, very exciting way of having music and quite a fun, playful way of having music presented to you when you're a child. So I guess like the Chart Show was also kind of, they were responsible for presenting, leading me to the Pet Shop Boys. It was through that program that I discovered who they were, and it was the video for Go West, which I just thought at the time was like, like I don't know if you've ever seen that video, but it's like visually they were presenting themselves in this very sort of like unique way that a lot of like pop stars just didn't do at the time. There was kind of like nothing like them really. So I guess I could have chosen Very as well, but I've chosen discography because I guess ultimately it's the one that I've kind of, these songs are kind of imprinted on my mind really, and it's just like I don't think I could ever get bored of hearing, like some of these tracks like West End Girls just still sound like it's the most incredible sort of like moody pop song.
Man,
it's like the production's just insane. And like, partly down to the fact they were kind of like, they were really, for a pop band, they were kind of really like clever, and that they were like mingling with a lot of like the, sort of like dance, what was going on in the dance world at the time, and that really reflects in the production and stuff like that. And I think like, Neil Tennant was also a journalist. He kind of, they were studying a lot of what was going on around them at the time, and I think that kind of obviously had some impact into what made their own work so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever sat down and listened to the Pet Shop Boys consciously.
Right,
it's been on,
right.
And I've never given it my full attention, I think, even when it's passed into my life. But obviously so many of these songs I realised I was very, very aware of. I mean, obviously West End Girls. But gosh, to actually have like a full-on ingestion of these pieces. Oh, I mean, as you said, with West End Girls in particular, I was blown away. It's very tempting to spend all my research kind of having that one on loop. Wow.
And the best thing about that song as well is like there's about like 15 odd different versions of it, so you can like rediscover the song many times, and there's also just other like the Elvis cover. I think it's really it's quite a clever tune really, like pop wise. And then just like Being Boring is another one, like it's like incredible sort of like melancholic sort of sophisticated sounding pop song. It's just it just kind of blows my mind every time I hear that one really.
When you think back to listening to it when you first got it, I can't remember if you mentioned the format that you got it on. Was it cassette?
I got it on cassette.
So when you think back to listening to it, where are you? What are you doing, like when you first got it?
Well, I first bought it from a CD, CD tape shop in France, just outside of Brittany. I was on holiday with my parents, and I just remember listening to this in the car as we're driving around. Like rewinding certain tracks. I think like the big ones were at the time were West End Girls, Suburbia. What Have I Done to Deserve This? Being Boring. Just kind of constantly rewinding those tunes and just sitting there listening to them, and just thinking, this is what it's all about, And just kind of legit, again, just sort of like looking at them and just like kind of, just thinking Chris Lowe was like the coolest looking motherfucker, It's just like just this kind of bizarre sort of like looking guy that just sort of like is in the background. You're just kind of like, what is he doing? Like, because also like I had no idea, like you don't understand electronic music really when you first, I didn't, it was like this thing that's just, like what a band is, and you understand instruments and, guitars, drums, you hit them, they make a sound, blah, blah, blah. But like, seeing the Pet Shop Boys on TV, just like seeing Neil Tennant singing and then Chris Lowe in the back with like one keyboard, and you're like, what? It just takes one keyboard to make this like music. It's like crazy, but like obviously it isn't, but you just don't have that kind of you're not privileged to that knowledge at the time, So that was kind of another kind of part of the mystery, and the love of it for me, that just sort of like drew me in and just got me like fascinated with music made on machines, I guess.
So where did that take you after you got into the Pet Shop Boys?
Pet Shop Boys, got into then Depeche Mode a few years later, because they came they came back with an album sort of around 1997. But the sort of difference between Depeche Mode and the Pet Shop Boys, even though there's kind of like many similarities on the surface, is like, I think Depeche Mode definitely sort of went on to be influenced and sort of tainted by kind of stadium rock,
right?
You know, they're kind of like really sort of like embrace this kind of like corny sort of like stadium rock vibe, which is kind of fun. But you know, like I think the Pet Shop Boys were always kind of like were a bit more interesting and a bit more conscious of the art of music and where it came from. And you know, I think Depeche Mode definitely just got like tainted by rock and roll in the end. But yeah, no, sorry, to go back to Depeche Mode, you know, obviously I got into like stuff like The Prodigy, which is around at the time, like, you know, Underworld, Orbital as well. That was another one I was like kind of another group I was kind of fascinated with for a short while.
Nice.
Yeah, just, you know, Future Sound of London, of course, you know, like the Aphex Twin, yeah, sort of anything that was kind of like, you know, electronic and would have kind of been either playing at Glastonbury Festival or maybe in like the indie press at the time. You know, that was kind of a lot of the stuff I was sort of discovering and enjoying. And then, yeah, so, you know, and then from that, you know, sort of like bands like Suicide and White House.
Yeah,
I kind of, you know, which I mean, kind of sounds ridiculous, but you know, like I definitely think that being into the Pet Shop Boys definitely made me kind of like appreciate Suicide and White House a bit easier later on, you know, even though they're kind of completely opposite ends of the music, electronic music spectrum, really.
Yeah, well, hearing you lay it out like that, that sounds like quite an organic trajectory when you lay out the bands in that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense in my head, you know.
Yeah,
yeah, kind of. That's good enough for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at this time, when you were just sort of finding your feet with electronic music and getting a sense of what was possible, where were you in terms of thinking about making your own music? I mean, had you started at this time, or were you kind of starting to get thoughts of how you might express yourself?
I'd made attempts to. I mean, I was playing in bands at school. I was playing guitar, but I'd also I remember my dad took me to a music tech fair in Olympia or Earls Court when I was about 13, and I remember there was a Roland stand, and they had an MC 505 MC 303 groovebox on there, and this was when it had just come out, and like I just remember playing with that for about 2 hours and just thinking like, oh, this is it, you know, like this is what I want to do. This is me, you know. And then I eventually got one like for Christmas about a year and a half later or something. And yeah, I was just kind of like, you know, lost in it, but never really sort of like did anything of worth with it, I would say, you know. But it definitely did kind of like, that was the, you know, made me realise that it wasn't, electronic music isn't this kind of like smoke and mirrors thing that I maybe thought it was to begin with. And then from there, sort of, you know, like being into punk as well at the time, and then playing in sort of like a few kind of punk bands, and that leading on to noise music and stuff. And that was, yeah, I guess that was kind of the way I found my way into it, I suppose, from the gutter up. Or maybe still in the gutter, right. Who knows, you know.
Depends who you ask, I guess. But,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so just to close out on this Pet Shop Boys record, I mean, do you have, I don't know how easy this is to answer, but do you have a favourite track?
Yeah, I'd say I could pick 3 tracks. It would be West End Girls, What Have I Done to Deserve This, and Being Boring, which I think are just like 3 of the greatest pop tracks of all time. And then maybe the best kind of like, you know, the ones you wouldn't necessarily think of but actually maybe are the best tracks on the record are Love Comes Quickly and the Sterling Void cover, It's All Right, which is like, you know, this is another thing, like going back to what I was saying actually about like the covers they did, you know, they did these covers that were just like, you just made them into their own songs, you know, like you listen to the covers and then you listen to the original versions and you're like, bloody hell, you know, they really did something with that, you know, like the Sterling Void one in particular is like, you know, I think I think of it as a different song in its own right, you know, it's just, yeah, beautiful tune.
If that's what you want, taste forbidden pleasures, whatever you want, you can fly away to the end of the world, but where does it get you to? 'Cause just when you least expect it, just what you least expect.
Great. Well, let's go to your second record now, Luke. If you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important as well.
Okay, so the second one is Scum by Napalm Death, which is a funny one because I guess sort of going back to what I was saying about hearing something at the time and then years later kind of becoming aware of its importance in your life. Like, this is definitely one that I can say that was definitely the case with this one. I mean, kind of thinking about, I've been sort of like trying to think over the last week as well, like when I actually first heard this, and it would have been my entry into Napalm Death was through hearing them on a CD, a cover mount CD with Kerrang from Kerrang, when an album from I can't remember what it's called. Hang on, I think it's Inside the Torn Apart. Inside the Torn Apart, which was kind of a bit more of a just like straight up kind of guess sort of like groove based metal album, like with kind of a bit more sort of like death metal kind of like more of a kind of like death metal version of like a lot of what was coming out on Earache and stuff at the time.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so hearing that and just kind of thinking, oh wow, this is kind of like, you know, this is quite exciting. You know, I've never heard anyone sing like that before, you know.
Yeah.
It's kind of worth noting as well, sort of like around sort of like 1997, I started reading Kerrang, and it was all full of these bands that I just never heard of before, you know, that were kind of, you'd never hear them on the radio. I mean, even though some of them are quite big, they wouldn't be played on the radio. The only time you'd ever really sort of discover them would be there was like rock programs on MTV that would be on like really, really late at night, and I could never watch them because it'd be on like a Tuesday on a, you know, at midnight or something like that, and I'd obviously be getting up for school the next day. So it was only really through kind of like these cover mount CDs with Kerrang that was sort of like able to hear this music, and yeah, the Napalm Death track kind of stuck with me. And then I remember buying this CD because I was kind of curious always to sort of like go back to the beginning of a band, you know, and kind of find out what would, you know, like start at the start and then kind of go on from there. And I remember buying this from HMV in Oxford Street and just kind of like seeing the number of tracks on the back of the back of the record and just being like, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, getting it home, listening to it, and just kind of just thinking, you know, like not really getting it, but kind of like knowing there's something there that, you know, this is a bizarre record, you know, like this is like nothing I've ever heard of before, but having obviously like not really much kind of frame of reference for it, other than, you know, what I would read in Kerrang, which kind of wasn't really that much, to be honest. Yeah, it just kind of had this sort of aura of mystery around it, I suppose. And then there was a period of, it was not too long after that, where they appeared on, do you remember TFI Friday with Chris Evans?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, that they appeared on TFI Friday.
What?
Yeah, it was kind of like, I guess it was sort of a bit of a joke, you know, that they were sort of brought in as like something to basically go, haha, like, check out this wacky band, you know. And they did, off this record, they did The Kill, You Suffer, and something else as well that I can't remember. But I remember The Kill because I was like, oh fuck, like this is off that CD. So that was quite, that was quite surreal, and seeing that, seeing them and just being like, wow, this is what they look like, blah blah blah. So then kind of fast forward, I guess, about maybe a few more years. In the meantime, listening to like John Peel, hearing other, like kind of similar things like, Extreme Noise Terror, I guess, who Peel used to play quite a bit. So yeah, getting into going to hardcore gigs for the first time, and then seeing bands play like music like what is on Scum, and seeing that in the flesh kind of like opened the world out a little bit more and sort of gave me the context that I didn't necessarily have when I first heard it, but also just kind of like realizing, oh fuck, like this they're basically all just sort of like ripping this record off, or kind of just being like, oh, this is like, this obviously must be where it all came from. And yeah, like I guess just over the years kind of reading about it, hearing more about it, I think it kind of had its like 30th anniversary like a couple of years ago or something. And just sort of like when obviously these like landmarks come up, and they kind of you get articles and stuff and people reflecting on it, and just kind of learning over time actually like how kind of like sort of unique this record is really, and how much how it kind of really did come out of nowhere. Yeah, it's just, and the fact also that it kind of is the intersection of a lot of the UK underground music that I enjoy and kind of hold dear, especially with regards to, it came from punk, but then also so many of the members then went on to do other things afterwards, like the lineup on the first side of Scum, the Justin Broadrick, Mick Harris, Nick Bullen lineup. Like Justin went on to obviously form Godflesh, but he was inspired by power electronics at the time and things like that. And I think I remember either reading somewhere or Nick Bullen telling me at one point that him and Justin met at on a market stall talking about Throbbing Gristle tapes,
Wow.
And then obviously Mick Harris and Nick went on to form Scorn, which then Mick kind of like carried on into the, like late 90s, and basically kind of, sort of, you can definitely sort of like trace that into things like dubstep, and, they were both sort of involved in drum and bass to a, like small degree. And Justin Now's like quite prolific as JK Flesh, doing a lot of like techno and stuff like that, but also kind of ambient music. And yeah, I just, you can trace so much back to this record. And I think, without Scum, it's like, I think the UK underground would be quite different, And then even the second side of the lineup, you've got the more metal part of the bands, which I guess went on to then define the band in later years. But, like Bill Steer from Carcass and Lee Dorian went on to Cathedral, and obviously runs Rise Above Records and stuff. There's kind of like, that kind of then sort of carried Napalm off into the sort of the world of metal, and which is what became their legacy really. But it's kind of they're a fascinating band to really sort of like think about. And this record in particular, it's kind of I think it just kind of spins me out every time I think about it really. I mean, that's it. I've had a few instances of listening to it prior to really fully grasping the context and the significance, and as you say, the way in which this lineup, or the two lineups here, flowered outward in so many different directions. And this is, I mean, the context of the record, I think I only really properly understood about 5 years ago, because when I first heard it, there's no way of really knowing, the whole thing about, obviously you don't have the internet like back then, or my internet access was very sort of like restricted or whatever. It was only at school I could really access it, and you couldn't just like read about all this stuff instantly then. It was just it just wasn't possible. And sort of the whole nuances of the fact that the A side and the second side of this record are essentially different bands.
Yeah.
That isn't something that I was ever really aware of, I would say, probably until about kind of 5 or so years ago. Like the back of the CD, it just says, thanks to Justin and Nick for playing on tracks 1 to 12, but that could have just been, oh yeah, it's just popped in and like did a little kind of guitar solo or whatever,
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Did you come to like the record prior to having that context to slot it into? Was there?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, because I liked it. When I definitely liked it when I first heard it. It was just more of a kind of like, it's the same as hearing when I heard White House. It's like I had to learn how to like it. I guess
Yes.
That's probably the best way of putting it. It's like, you understand that when you hear something that challenges you for the first time, and you like it, but you don't know why you like it, and you have to learn and understand what it is that you like about it.
Yes.
And that takes, it takes time, and it's kind of part of what makes a record like this so rewarding,
And you sent across as well a link to a documentary which I watched through this morning, which goes into the history as told by Mick Harris. He kind of runs through everything and takes, the camera into the studio where they recorded Scum and the rehearsal space at his old house. And what was it about the documentary in particular that you thought meant that it was important to have as a kind of companion to this album when you sent it over?
Well, I just think it kind of lays the history of it out in, pretty like plain terms. And it's kind of interesting to think of Napalm Death really originally as a punk band, which I guess is exactly what they were. And that's kind of something that, you only really discover about the band when you kind of like go deep into the roots of this record.
Yeah.
Mick Harris is a really kind of funny, charismatic guy, I think,
Yeah.
like I've never met him, but he's like, his presence and, the way he kind of talks about stuff, I just find kind of endlessly entertaining, in the best way possible, of course,
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, so just kind of like being aware of the origin of where the band was at when they walked into the studio to record that A side, for 50 quid or whatever it was, like, and then the acceleration on the B side into this kind of like thing where we just want to play as fast as possible, and it's kind of like, in some way, like, kind of think of it as like the acceleration of punk in a sense. It's kind of like, this is in a way punk's last truly sort of experimental record. It's sort of the final frontier of punk in my eyes,
Right.
Accelerated to a point where it just can't go anymore, it can't evolve anymore. It's like, Mick Harrison basically took the beat from Chaos UK and turned it into what's now the blast beat, and it's, you can't take it any further, really.
Yeah, it's like terminal velocity.
Yeah.
And it's great to see as well Mick kind of just sit behind the kit and demo the blast beat as well with the alternate cymbals. Like it kind of clicked why it sounds so frenetic when you've got like 2 layers of cymbal wash going on at once. You're like, yeah. I also enjoyed the anecdote that they said that when they went on tour, they would knock down as many doors in the venue.
It's amazing that, yeah. He calls it doing indoors. Him and Barney Greenway would do that. Yeah, it's kind of like dumb as fuck, but kind of hilarious at the same time.
Yeah, it definitely fits, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is a point as well in the documentary where one of the interviewees, a music journalist, I believe, talks about the fact that while there are 2 distinct sides, in his opinion, it's a kind of coherent whole. But I mean, do you have a preferred side of the record of the 2 lineups?
I was thinking about this. I kind of like, I guess if I had a gun to my head, which I hope isn't going to happen anytime soon, I would probably say the first side, and that's mainly just because, you know, it's got Justin and Nick on it, who then went on to kind of just like the whole thing I was saying about the acceleration, the thinking about it as an acceleration of punk, you know, sort of thinking of them kind of like doing that and then just kind of like dropping their instruments and just being like, well, we've done that now, so you know, let's do something else. And then, you know, going on to do Godflesh and Scorn, which is kind of like it's a bold move, you know. And then Mick retaining the vision and pushing through with new musicians, and then also creating something new and unprecedented, and then just running with that and taking it into it's amazing, really. You know, like it's kind of it just fills me with joy to listen to and think about. Like, I love it.
It's fabulous. I think it's so great, this idea that almost the band had so much energy that it blew itself apart midway through, halfway through. Yeah,
exactly.
How good is that?
I mean, what other, you know, I kind of think what would it have been like if that second side hadn't have been recorded? You know, it's kind of like, it's kind of funny to think about, like, if it had just then ended up becoming this another obscure punk relic that had come out of that sort of like DIY anarcho scene at the time, you know, like if it just sort of been left around and, you know, sort of like dug up 20 years later, but obviously without any of the stuff that had come after it to really kind of like frame it in the context which makes it so unique in the first place.
Totally. Yeah, particularly because I read that first half was designed initially to be part of a split release, which, you know, no one I mean, it's, you know, unfortunate there's no real reason for it, but no one talks about seminal splits, do they? It's albums that get canonized.
Well, it's more common in hardcore, I guess. I mean, a seminal split. I did actually think about a seminal split when I was thinking of these records to pick, and actually there is the split on Discord between The Faith and Void is, I would definitely say, is a seminal split. But you know, that's a very pedantic thing of me to say, Jack. So I apologise. You know, I don't mean to pick apart your words there, but yeah,
not at all. Stand corrected. Have you seen Napalm Death play live?
No, I haven't actually. I had a ticket to see them about 11 years ago when they played at the Camden Underworld, and I was too hungover to go.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Do you think you'll go see them now?
Yes, I would do. Yeah. Because I mean, I still listen to their records. You know, like I still check out the records. Like the one from a few years ago, Utilitarian, is pretty good. You know, it's got like it's kind of more of like they ended up kind of getting into this more sort of like technical death metal sound, which kind of got slightly tainted by a more kind of like groove orientated thing in the 90s, like kind of, I don't know, I guess like proto nu metal, like Machine Head or something like that. They kind of definitely did get a bit kind of affected by that, but then they went back into, like in the 2000s, they kind of went back into more of a kind of harsh sound that was more of this kind of like technical death metal, but influenced by, you know, things like Coalesce and stuff like that, who, you know, they did a split with and stuff. And yeah, I think that Utilitarian album's like thoroughly decent. You know, it's got even like John Zorn pops up on it and does a sax solo for like a brief moment, you know. Yeah, and it sounds great.
Oh, amazing.
So yeah, I would go and see them. They played a few years ago as well at the Electric Ballroom with Brugeria and someone else, I can't remember. And I very nearly went, but I just couldn't afford it, so you know, I didn't bother. I did go and see Carcass play at the Underworld a while ago for. You know, they did a 3-night residency there, and tickets were $5. So I went because it was $5. Yeah,
that's good going.
Yeah, it was good.
Nice. amazing. Yeah, I've seen them a couple of times actually, but
Oh right, whereabouts?
once in Weymouth, which
Right.
it's incredibly bleak. My partner was in a power violence band at the time, so she played in support of them.
What was the band called?
Her band was Witch Cult.
I've heard of Witch Cult.
Really? Oh, fabulous! Yeah, they were incredible. But I think that was certainly it made so much sense that they were in support because again, I
Witch
think
Cult. The singer is Dean.
yeah, Dean. Yeah,
He was Dean.
Yeah.
I know Dean. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we played in a band
Yeah.
together actually.
Oh right.
Yeah,
okay.
so it all connects together. But yeah, I mean, I love the fact that they're still playing tracks off Scum. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and even though like none of those members were on that record, it's part of the history of what they are now. Like they wouldn't be there on stage if it wasn't for those songs. So why shouldn't they play them? They own them. It's kind of I mean, I kind of think of Napalm Death as they're practically a British institution these days.
So let's go to your final record now, Luke. If you could give me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important as well.
Okay, so this the third album it's by Adam Bowman and it's called Music and Words. And I guess sort of going to why this one's important or why I decided this one was important was I guess it was the first time I'd ever really heard free improvisation on record and also presented in a way that was kind of so different to how I had seen it presented in a live context. So just to kind of like give a little bit of background on that, I guess kind of like I was going to a lot of gigs in London, sort of from the early 2000s onwards. And I used to go to this thing called Boat Ting, which was a night that was on a boat that was docked by Temple tube station on the Thames, just by the South Bank. And it was kind of like really, really strange night because it was booked by a guy who played drums in a band called Naught, who were kind of like I think they're still playing actually, like technically they're still together, but they're kind of like a very, very technical math rock band, I guess, and the drummer from that band used to curate this event, and his partner at the time was I think it like she would do the other side of the curation, which was a lot more of the kind of like free improvisation and like weird performance art stuff that would happen there. So you kind of had this like, you go there, you'd see a band, albeit kind of like a sort of more like left field kind of like experimental one, but like, like a band nonetheless. And then you just get some like weird, like wacky as hell free improv, like right after it, and then maybe like someone like reciting a poem about their genitalia at the end. It's just like this like mad kind of like cross section of like stuff that was going on in the London like DIY London music scene at the time. And I remember going to I went there once and I saw the Country Teasers and the Bowman Family, which was Adam Bowman and his brother Jonathan Bowman, who are the Bowman brothers, but it was the thing they did with an extended group of people, so hence the Bowman brothers became the Bowman Family. And just kind of remember seeing Adam Bowman playing with his table of just completely random objects, you know, with like, and just thinking like, you know, trying to place it in my head, like how it was he came to be performing with these and what they did and what, you know, like if there was any kind of like logic behind the sequence in which they were being used, but then kind of like realizing after, you know, sort of like 10 or 15 minutes that just like it was kind of pointless to think about any sort of anything like that. And I guess that was kind of the important in sort of like breaking down free improvisation to me, just in a way like it's probably best not to just not think about it and just kind of take it in and accept it for what it is. Mm-hmm. And the Bowman family were sort of like nothing else I'd really seen, also in the sense that it was very funny, you know, like there was this element of comedy about it where, you know, they could be telling jokes, but these aren't like necessarily things that you would recognise as jokes, you know. It's a more kind of like absurdist, kind of like almost Dadaist kind of approach to humour. So yeah, and then I think I saw Bowman Brothers play another time after that. You know, they were always kind of like popping up at various sort of events that I was going to. But then a friend of mine like gave me this CD one day, and you know, like before then I'd never really actually sort of ever considered the fact that any of these people were recording what they did. And I never really kind of thought it was something that you could ever listen to.
Right.
So yeah, getting this CD and being kind of like, wow, these guys actually make music, you know, that's kind of like, that's interesting. And my friend just being like, just, you have to listen to this. It's like, it's my favourite album. Like, and this, you know, which is kind of like when someone tells you it's their favourite album and it's an Adam Bowman CD, you know, you should probably be like, oh, it's, yeah, okay. This is first on the pile to listen to. And just kind of, yeah, as soon as I put it on, I was just like, you know, I listened to it all the way through. You know, I was laughing. It was just, yeah, it's just great. And there are things, you know, things on the first two tracks, you know, which like, kind of, I love the way it starts off with these kind of, you know, metallic sounds and, you know, these sort of like textures, which also I'd not heard on record before. And I think that there's definitely been an influence in my own work. You know, I've kind of like gone on to use a lot of the same kind of like textures in what I do. And yeah, just kind of then how that turns into this like bizarre kind of like tape collage of a documentation of his Christmas. You know, these like odd sort of like moments where he's just kind of like walking around like the town he's from and looking into people's houses and stuff like that, you know, going to the pub, just like general sort of these mundane moments, but sort of documented in a way that makes you think, well, why is he documenting this? You know, like, you know, like, but the surrealness and absurdity of it just kind of like takes over and just kind of takes you in it, you know. It's kind of, it just brings you along and makes you just kind of, I don't know, love it. It's like, yeah, I think it's kind of like nothing else, this record, you know. I mean, when I listen to it now, I still kind of, you know, I almost approach it to kind of like I would watching a film or something, you know, like if there's a film you really like, you set out you know, like a space of, you know, like time to just sit down and watch it, and so you can like get drawn into it. And it's kind of the same with this record, you know. I kind of approach it in the same way. It's almost like listening to a podcast, I guess, or something, you know. Like, it's something I definitely like to listen to at night before going to bed, you know, headphones in, and just kind of like, yeah, I'm there again with Adam at Waterloo Station. We're going back to his mum's house for Christmas, you know. Yeah.
You mentioned that you laugh out loud when you listen to it, and I think the text that accompanies the record on the Bandcamp it starts with the line something like, "When's the last time you laughed out loud at an avant-garde record?" or something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, because even when avant-garde records are trying to be funny, they very rarely are. I find, like I don't actually really like humour, over explicit humour in music, and especially not experimental avant-garde music. But the way the humour arises in this record and the way why I like it so much, I think, is because of that kind of like absurdist kind of, just sort of like what the hell is going on here? Why is this thing, being?
Yeah.
If that makes any sense, like
why is this Turkish Delight getting such an intense review on tape?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's like one part as well, which just like where he's reading out the recipe for that fish dish.
Yes.
And then you've just got the like the monotonous sort of like reading of this recipe with this kind of like absolutely fucking mental music that he's listening to in the background. You're just like, what on earth are you listening to? Just like trying to imagine these environments which are just sort of like documented like so kind of like brutally in a way, like yeah. And I mean there's another thing as well, like the music he listens to whilst he's like reciting these sort of like monologues is kind of, it's always sort of quite interesting. At one point there's that kind of like gentle sort of like soothing raga in the background as well, which kind of just pops up. And
there's a point I think as well where his mum says that she can't hack what he's listening to. It was driving her mad, so she turned it off.
Yeah
And then she hops off upstairs and he's like, right, time to put it back on again.
Yeah
I had a great time with this. I mean, I think his tone of voice as well is, I mean, comedically immaculate. He's got a very deliberate sense of timing and tonality by the sounds of it.
Well, it's very dry, but I also wonder if it's like, I can never work out with Adam Bowman if the dryness is intentional or if it's just the way he is and the way he talks. And I have a feeling it may be the latter, But obviously there's I mean, I've only ever met Adam Bowman once, and I saw him at London Bridge train station at about 11:30 at night, and I just went up to him and I was like, oh, you're Adam Bowman, aren't you? And he was like, oh yeah.
Wow.
And he had this like amplifier with him, and just like kind of, I guess he'd just done a gig and he was carting his way back to home or whatever in South London. And I had a bass guitar with me, and he just started asking me about my bass guitar, and then train came, and then that was it. I've never actually spoken to him again, but
did you tell him about this record and the fact that it kind of meant so much to you? Did that?
No, not really. No, I don't. I kind of feel like I don't really need to.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe someone might send him a link to this or something afterwards. But yeah.
He refers also during the recording. Actually, there's two things that I really, really like, which come up in my mind at the moment. There's a point where he says "moving forward in time now" at the start of one of his recordings, which is so fabulous. It's like he's aware of the fact that there's a lot of like when he's editing it together, people are going to feel a sudden jump, but said so casually. There's another bit where there's several bits where he talks about the tape recorder like mucking up and screwing up, which again I think is wonderful given that he's manipulating so much of it anyway. But I mean, you talk about wanting to perhaps have humour as a part of your music and the music that you do, and trying to incorporate that. I mean, is kind of failure or things not going as intended, is that something that fits within the frame of the way that you approach your music as well?
Possibly, but I would kind of, I guess I would never show it, if that makes any sense. Like, not out of any way of wanting to show a weakness or anything to the like work itself, but just kind of, I don't know how it could sort of manifest in the work and for that to come through, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, I think it would be very difficult to, I think with my kind of, the music that I make, it kind of does have, you know, like, for better or worse, like, it sort of has ended up being perceived in this kind of, like, meticulous way, perhaps. And I don't mind that, because, you know, that's kind of like, that is kind of part of how it comes across anyway, you know, like, it's kind of part of the process of making it. So any kind of like imperfection or anything or any mistake, if it was to arise, I think it would probably just appear intentional afterwards, and I wouldn't communicate that
Right.
it was anything but, you know, unless I was asked specifically about, oh, so what about this one piece on your, you know, this track where this thing just comes in, or, you know, I'd be like, oh, you know, of course I'm happy to explain then, you know, but I would kind of feel no reason to explicitly reveal the origins of it.
Yeah, fair. I mean, certainly a couple of points on your record where there are elements that come in that feel almost to have some form of rhythmic alignment with other elements, and then explicitly don't, which, I mean, maybe doesn't fit into the framework of failure, but certainly maybe a looseness. Certainly.
Well, it's like a lot of the time things like that are just complete chance, you know, and it's like, I guess a lot of the way I work with stuff is like I have a lot of things accumulated, and, you know, sometimes I'm just like, oh, I wonder what this thing will sound like if I, you know, put this in the track and run this alongside, you know, like a repetitive loop or something. And then, you know, you get these like moments where you're like, oh, well, they kind of work together. They sit nicely together, you know, where they're sort of like it sounds like they're in sync, but they're not, you know. It's just sort of multiple processes of just chipping away at stuff until you kind of reach this point where you've found something that kind of works, but you sort of don't know why it works, if that makes any sense.
Inside the Elms shopping centre, listening to the Salvation Army band. All the instruments are silver, apart from one golden baritone horn.
Again, absolutely adoring the record, and it's been wonderful to speak to you as well about these three important albums as well. So thank you, Luke. It's been great to speak to you.
No, thanks, Jack. Yeah, thanks for asking. It's been a pleasure.
And if people want to keep up to speed with what you're doing, where should they be going online?
Well, as loath as I kind of am to say, the best place at the moment is the Facebook page. But I am working on a website at the moment, which is kind of taking a bit of time, partly down to my own lackluster kind of approach, but, well, to the website at least. But yeah, so for now, Facebook, social media channels, you know, blah, 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 all those kind of horrible, toxic places that we seem to find ourselves spending more and more time at.
It's grim, isn't it?
In the moment,
Yeah, and on that thoroughly dystopian note, thank you very much once again, and to everyone listening, I will see you next time.